Imagine waking up on a Tuesday morning, pouring your first cup of coffee, and hearing 3 sharp knocks at your door that instantly tell you your entire day, maybe your entire life, is about to be derailed. That's exactly what happened to me at 7 a.m. on a day that started like any other. I was flipping through property management reports, half awake, when the banging started. 3 quick raps, pause, 3 more. A pattern I recognized immediately. The same knock my father had used my entire life when he wanted compliance, not conversation. I knew before I even reached the peephole that this wasn't going to be a casual visit. And sure enough, there they were, both my parents standing in the hallway like they were serving a warrant. Dad's face was already that particular shade of red that meant he'd spent the entire drive over building a case against me. Mom clutched a manila folder against her chest like it contained classified documents. Michael, open this door, now. 30 years as a high school principal had given Dad a voice that could make grown adults feel like teenagers caught skipping class. I unlocked the deadbolt and they walked in dressed for a boardroom. Dad in his navy suit, Mom in her funeral and court appearances, dress with the pearl necklace that had terrified my childhood friends. "Good morning," I said, stepping aside. "Coffee? We're not here for pleasantries." And just like that, my ordinary Tuesday morning became anything but ordinary. Dad strode into my living room like he was conducting an inspection, Mom following with her folder at the ready. They positioned themselves in the center of the room, his principal stance, her with documents already half pulled from the folder. "This is about your living situation and the family's financial obligations." That formal tone, that was the warning bell. When my parents switched to business language, it meant they'd already made decisions about my life and were now just going through the motions of telling me about them. "My living situation seems fine," I said, closing the door. "Rent's paid, utilities are current, neighbors are quiet." "That's exactly the problem." Dad's voice carried that patient condescension he'd spent decades perfecting, the tone he used with students who refused to see the obvious. "You've gotten too comfortable, Michael. You're 31 years old. You should be building equity, planning for your future, working toward home ownership." Mom opened her folder and produced what looked like a real estate brochure. Glossy photos, detailed specs, the whole production. "We found you a lovely 1-bedroom condo in Riverside Heights. The mortgage payment would actually be less than what you're paying in rent here. You'd be building wealth instead of throwing money away." I looked at the listing. They'd clearly spent weeks on this. Color photos, professional printouts. This wasn't a spontaneous conversation. This was a coordinated intervention with visual aids and everything. "I like living here," I said simply. Liking something isn't the same as making smart financial choices. Dad began pacing, cataloging my apartment like evidence. "Your mother and I have watched you waste money on rent for 8 years. 8 years, Michael. Do you have any idea how much equity you could have built?" Mom consulted her folder like she was reading from a teleprompter. "We calculated that you've paid approximately $96,000 in rent since you moved out. $96,000 that could have gone toward real wealth." The specificity told me they'd done their homework. Credit checks, mortgage calculators, probably spreadsheets. My parents approached everything like the budget managers they were. Thorough, methodical, and absolutely convinced that their way was the only way. "The rental market in this area is unstable," Dad continued. "Rent increases, gentrification, building conversions. You could be forced to move at any time. Probably into another apartment," I said, refilling my coffee. "Anyone want a bagel?" "Michael, you're not taking this seriously." Mum's voice carried that frustrated edge from when I was 16 and hadn't applied to the colleges they'd pre-selected. "We're trying to help you build a stable future. I have a stable future. No, Dad shook his head with that disappointed principal expression. Living in someone else's building, subject to their decisions about rent and maintenance. That's not stability, that's dependency. He walked to my window, surveying the tree-lined street below. This area's nice enough, but you're paying premium prices for someone else's investment. Every month, you're making your landlord wealthy while building nothing for yourself. The irony was so profound, I almost smiled. But I'd learned long ago that correcting my parents' assumptions only led to longer arguments and more elaborate interventions. Mom pulled out more paperwork, spreading it across my coffee table like she was presenting at a corporate meeting. The condo we found has everything you need. 1 bedroom, 1 bath, updated kitchen, in-unit laundry, assigned parking. The HOA fee covers maintenance, landscaping, and building security. The listing was genuinely nice. Modern appliances, granite countertops. The kind of place designed for young professionals who wanted the appearance of ownership without the actual headaches of property management. 15-minute drive from here, Dad added. Close enough that you can maintain your routines while building equity and establishing real roots. Their research was thorough. Their arguments were logical, based on conventional wisdom about real estate that financial advisors have been dispensing for decades. If you'd asked any random person on the street, they'd probably agree with my parents. But here's the thing about conventional wisdom. It's only wise if it applies to your actual situation. I appreciate the research, I said carefully, but I'm not interested in moving. Not interested or afraid of the commitment. There it was, the challenge, the implication that my reluctance revealed some character flaw. Home ownership requires responsibility, Michael. Long-term thinking. Maybe that's what's really holding you back. The accusation of immaturity was familiar territory, part of a long-running family narrative about my supposed reluctance to embrace adult responsibilities. Or maybe you've gotten too comfortable with the easy option, Mom added, her voice gentler but carrying the same message. Renting feels simpler because you don't have to worry about maintenance or property taxes. But simple isn't always better. Dad warmed to his favorite theme. Sometimes you need to push yourself toward challenges that pay off in the long run. I sat on my couch and let them outline their vision of my future. Mortgage payments, property tax schedules, home equity loans for additional investments. They thought through every detail of a life they believed I should want, without ever asking if I actually wanted it. The seller is motivated, Mum continued, consulting her notes. They've already moved to Phoenix, so they're open to reasonable offers and flexible closing dates. We could co-sign the mortgage, Dad offered, help you get better interest rates until your financial situation stabilizes. The offer of financial assistance came with unspoken strings, ongoing oversight, opinions about my spending, input on my career choices. I knew that dance. I don't need help with my credit score. Everyone can use help with something. Dad's tone suggested he knew better than I did what I needed. The important thing is taking action before you get stuck in permanent renting. Mom pulled out what looked like a timeline, deadlines for mortgage applications, home inspections, closing procedures. If we move quickly, you could be in your new place by the end of next month. The assumption that I'd obviously want to rush toward their chosen solution was so typical. They identified problems, researched solutions, and presented conclusions as if my agreement was just a formality. I'm not buying a condo. The words hung in the air, like a challenge to everything they'd spent weeks preparing. Dad's expression shifted through disappointment, frustration, and finally, that principled anger he reserved for students who refused guidance that was obviously in their best interests. Michael, sometimes you have to make decisions based on logic, not emotion. We've done the research, we've run the numbers, we've identified the best option. You can't just dismiss good advice because it requires change. I can dismiss advice I don't want. Want isn't the issue. Mom's voice sharpened. Need is the issue. You need to start building wealth. You need to establish roots. You need to stop throwing away money on rent. What I need is for you to respect my choices about where I live. We'd reached the familiar inflection point, helpful suggestions transforming into demands backed by family authority and emotional pressure. Your choices haven't been particularly wise so far. Dad's principal voice carried the finality of a judgment that couldn't be appealed. 8 years of rent payments with nothing to show for it except cancelled checks. Which is why we're intervening now, Mom added, her folder still full of documentation. Before you waste even more money on a lifestyle that builds nothing for your future. Intervening. That word was particularly telling. They viewed my housing situation as a crisis requiring family action, not a personal choice, deserving respect. I'm not wasting money. I'm paying for a place to live. You're paying for the privilege of making someone else wealthy. Dad circled my living room like he was cataloguing evidence. Every month, you hand over a substantial check to a landlord who uses your rent to build his own equity. He paused at my bookshelf, scanning titles like he was looking for clues about my flawed thinking. Do you even know who owns this building? Have you ever met the person getting rich from your monthly payments? The question was rhetorical, designed to highlight my disconnection from financial reality rather than gather actual information. As a matter of fact, I do know who owns this building. Some investment company, probably, Mom said dismissively, or a property management firm that treats tenants like numbers on a spreadsheet. Maybe a foreign investor, Dad added, with the disdain he reserved for people who made money without what he considered honest work. Someone who doesn't care about the community, just the monthly cash flow. Their assumptions about absentee landlords were probably accurate for many buildings in the area, based on news stories and financial articles. Their skepticism made sense. The point is, Dad continued, you're working to pay off someone else's mortgage instead of your own. You're building their wealth instead of yours. After 8 years, you have nothing tangible to show for it. Nothing except a place to live that I enjoy in a neighborhood I love. Enjoyment doesn't build wealth. Mom's tone suggested happiness was a luxury responsible adults couldn't afford. Security builds wealth. Ownership builds wealth. Equity builds wealth. She pulled out financial projections, professionally looking graphs showing potential returns on real estate investment over various time horizons. If you'd bought property 8 years ago instead of renting, you'd have at least $40,000 in equity by now, maybe more depending on market appreciation. The numbers were probably accurate. My parents had invested serious time in building a compelling financial argument. And in another 8 years, you'd own the property outright, instead of still paying rent with nothing to show for it. Dad added, that's the difference between thinking strategically and just drifting through life. Drifting. The accusation suggested my contentment reflected a broader pattern of avoiding adult responsibilities. I have a plan, I said quietly. Continuing to rent indefinitely isn't a plan, it's avoidance. The conversation had evolved from helpful suggestion to family intervention, complete with research, documentation, and coordinated pressure designed to overcome my resistance. The condo won't be available forever, Dad warned. Real estate moves quickly in desirable areas. The market doesn't reward hesitation, Mom added. The urgency felt artificial, designed to prevent me from developing counter-arguments or finding alternative solutions to problems I hadn't known I had until this morning. I understand you've done a lot of research, I said carefully, but I'm not interested in buying property right now. Not interested or not ready to accept adult responsibility. Dad's question was sharp because there's a difference and it matters for how we move forward. The implication that refusing their advice indicated immaturity was familiar from years of family conversations where my choices were interpreted as character flaws rather than legitimate preferences. Maybe not ready, Mum said more gently, though disappointment still colored her voice, which is understandable, but not something you can avoid indefinitely. Home ownership is intimidating at first, Dad acknowledged, but like most worthwhile challenges, it becomes manageable once you commit to the process. They were offering the kind of patient encouragement that had helped me learn to drive, apply to college, and navigate other transitions. The problem was that I didn't need encouragement because I wasn't facing a challenge or avoiding a responsibility. I appreciate your concern, but I'm happy with my current situation. Happiness isn't enough. Dad's voice was firm. You need security. You need to be building something for your future instead of just enjoying the present. What if something happens to your income? Mum added, her voice carrying the worry that had motivated decades of careful financial planning. If you own property, you have equity you can borrow against. If you're renting, you have nothing. The scenarios they painted were legitimately concerning, based on economic uncertainties and personal experiences with financial setbacks that had shaped their conservative approach. Or what if the building owner decides to sell, or convert to condos, or raise rents beyond what you can afford? Dad continued. You'd have to move on someone else's timeline, maybe to a neighborhood you can't afford or don't want to live in. As a renter, you have no control over your most basic need, Mom concluded. That's not a sustainable way to live. Their arguments were logical. Their concerns were reasonable, based on conventional wisdom about the advantages of home ownership. The problem was that their entire analysis was built on assumptions about my situation that were fundamentally incorrect. Actually, I said, standing and walking to my desk, I do have housing security. I pulled out a folder from my drawer, one containing documents far more official and legally binding than anything in Mom's real estate collection. What kind of security? Dad asked, skepticism evident. The kind that comes with owning the building. The statement landed like a bomb. My parents looked at me with expressions of pure confusion, as if I just claimed something that contradicted basic facts about reality. What do you mean, owning the building? Mom asked slowly. I opened my folder and pulled out the deed, property tax records, and mortgage documentation that established my legal ownership of the 4-story brownstone we were currently sitting in. I mean, I bought this building 3 years ago through Meridian Holdings LLC. I handed them the deed, watching their faces as they processed information that made their entire intervention irrelevant. I'm not paying rent to a landlord, I'm paying myself. Dad took the document with hands that weren't quite steady, scanning the legal language that clearly established my ownership. This is impossible, Mom whispered. You work at the nonprofit. Your salary isn't enough to buy a building like this. The nonprofit salary covers my living expenses, I explained. The building generates rental income from the other 3 units that more than covers the mortgage, taxes, and maintenance. The financial dynamics of my situation were apparently completely different from what they'd assumed during their weeks of research and planning. But you never said anything, Dad said, bewilderment in his voice. We thought you were struggling with rent payments, making poor financial choices. You thought what you wanted to think because it supported your narrative about my irresponsibility. Mom was studying the property tax records with the careful attention she'd once devoted to reviewing my report cards. Michael, this building is worth It says it's assessed at $1.2 million. Market value is probably closer to $1.8 million now, I said matter-of-factly. Real estate appreciation has been strong in this neighborhood. The numbers hit them like physical blows, each figure contradicting months of assumptions about my financial situation. Where did you get the money for a down payment? Dad asked, his principal's training evident as he tried to piece together facts that didn't match his understanding. I saved it from my previous job in finance before I decided to transition to non-profit work. I retrieved additional documents from my folder. The building was a foreclosure property that needed renovation. I got it below market value. You worked in finance? Mom's voice carried the same confusion she might have shown if I'd announced I'd once been a professional athlete. 6 years, right after college, investment banking, then private equity. I handed her my old business cards from Goldman Sachs and Blackstone, tangible proof of a career history they'd apparently never known about. I saved most of my salary and bonuses because I knew I wanted to transition to mission-driven work eventually. The business cards seemed to mesmerize her, physical evidence of achievements and financial resources that had somehow remained invisible during years of family conversations. But you never mentioned. We had no idea. You never asked about my work history. You just assumed I'd always been struggling because I chose non-profit work over higher-paying careers. The assumption had probably seemed reasonable based on stereotypes about non-profit salaries and their observations of my modest lifestyle. Mom said slowly, "If you own this building, why do you live so simply? Why don't you have a car or expensive furniture or any of the things wealthy people usually buy?" Because I don't need those things to be happy. And because keeping my expenses low maximizes the passive income from the building. The concept of choosing simplicity despite having resources seemed as foreign to them as the revelation of my property ownership. But people will think. Mom struggled to articulate concerns about social perceptions. Your lifestyle suggests people will think I'm content with what I have instead of constantly pursuing more expensive signals of success. His expression shifting between bewilderment and something that looked like the beginning of anger. "Why didn't you tell us?" he asked finally. "Why let us worry about your financial future if you're actually wealthy?" Because every time I tried to explain that I was fine, you interpreted it as denial or immaturity. I gestured toward Mom's folder of condo listings. Like today, you arrived with a complete plan for reorganizing my life based on assumptions you never verified. The truth of this observation seemed to register, though not in ways suggesting they were ready to acknowledge the pattern. "We were trying to help," Mom said defensively. "We thought you were throwing away money on rent and avoiding the responsibilities of home ownership. You were trying to fix problems I didn't have, based on information you never gathered." The conversation was interrupted by Dad's phone ringing. He looked at the caller ID with an expression that suggested whoever was calling wasn't someone he wanted to speak with at the moment. "It's your Uncle Jerry," he told Mom. "He's probably calling about the eviction notice." The words hung in the air like an admission of something they'd hoped to avoid discussing. What eviction notice? Mum and Dad exchanged the kind of look that passes between people caught in something they'd hoped to keep secret. "Well," Dad said slowly, "we may have been a bit more proactive in our approach to helping you make this transition." "Proactive how?" Mom opened her folder and pulled out a document that looked official and threatening, complete with a legal letterhead and language about tenant rights and eviction procedures. "We had Jerry draft an eviction notice," she admitted, "just in case you were resistant to making the change voluntarily." I took the document and scanned its contents. Detailed legal language about lease violations, property sales, and mandatory vacating procedures. "This says I have to vacate the premises within 24 hours. due to building sale and lease termination. It's not real, Dad said quickly. Jerry just made it look official to add some urgency to your decision-making process. You created fake legal documents to force me out of my apartment. The question seemed to highlight the scope of their presumption in ways that made them both visibly uncomfortable. We thought a little pressure might help you overcome your hesitation, Mum explained, her voice defensive. And if that didn't work, you were planning to do what exactly? Call the police, Dad admitted. Jerry said eviction enforcement requires law enforcement involvement. We were prepared to take that step if necessary. The casual mention of involving police in their family intervention revealed a level of commitment to their plan that went far beyond helpful suggestion. Actually, I said, pulling out my phone, let's call them right now. Michael, that's not necessary. Mom's voice was quick, anxious. We can work this out as a family. You created fake legal documents and threatened police involvement. I think it's very necessary. I dialed 911 before they could object further, requesting officers to respond to a landlord-tenant dispute involving fraudulent eviction documents. What are you doing? Dad asked, his voice tight with the kind of panic he'd probably felt when students threatened to report his disciplinary methods. I'm letting you follow through on your plan to call the police. The 20 minutes we spent waiting for officers to arrive were among the most uncomfortable of our family history. Mom kept consulting her folder, like it might contain solutions to problems she hadn't anticipated. Dad paced around my living room with the restless energy of someone whose carefully planned intervention had spiraled beyond his control. When the officers arrived, they entered with the professional wariness that police bring to domestic disputes that have escalated beyond verbal disagreement. Someone called about a landlord-tenant issue, Officer Martinez asked, looking between the three of us with practiced assessment. Yes, I said, handing him my phone with the property deed displayed. These people are trying to evict me from my own building using fraudulent legal documents. Officer Martinez studied my phone screen, then looked at Dad with an expression that suggested he was reassessing the situation. Sir, you need to step away from the property owner immediately. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to diffusing situations that could escalate into criminal charges. The transformation in the room's dynamics was immediate and profound. Dad, who had entered my apartment with the confidence of someone exercising legitimate authority, suddenly found himself being treated as a potential criminal by a police officer. There's been a misunderstanding, Dad said quickly. We're his parents. We were trying to help him make better housing decisions. Officer Martinez's partner, Officer Chin, had taken the fraudulent notice from Mum's folder and was examining it with obvious skepticism. This document claims legal authority it doesn't possess. That's fraud. It wasn't meant to be taken seriously, Mum said, her voice small and defensive. We just wanted to add some urgency to encourage him to consider home ownership. Ma'am, creating false legal documents is a criminal offense, regardless of your intentions, Officer Martinez explained, and attempting to use fraudulent paperwork to force someone from their home constitutes harassment and potentially criminal coercion. The legal terminology seemed to hit my parents with the force of consequences they'd never considered during their planning process. Are you pressing charges? Officer Chin asked me. I looked at my parents, standing in my living room with expressions of shock and dawning understanding about how far their helpful intervention had strayed from legal behavior. Not this time, I said, but I want them to understand any future attempts to interfere with my housing situation will result in criminal charges and restraining orders. Understood. Officer Martinez's tone suggested he thought I was being more generous than the situation warranted. Folks, you need to leave this property immediately and not return unless invited by the owner. But he's our son, Mum protested weakly, and he's an adult property owner who can make his own decisions about housing and visitors, Officer Chin replied. Family relationships don't give you the right to create fraudulent documents or threaten illegal evictions. My parents gathered their belongings with the careful movements of people still processing how dramatically their mourning had diverged from their planned family intervention. At the door, Dad turned back one final time. Michael, we really were trying to help. We thought you needed guidance about building wealth and planning for the future. What I needed was for you to ask about my actual situation instead of making assumptions based on limited information. We had no idea about your financial resources or property ownership, Mom added. You live so modestly. We thought you were struggling. Living modestly when you have resources is called financial discipline. It's what allows people to build wealth instead of just displaying it. The concept seemed genuinely foreign to them, contradicting decades of assumptions about the relationship between wealth and lifestyle choices. After they left, I sat in my living room drinking coffee and reviewing the property documents that had transformed their carefully planned intervention into a lesson about the dangers of making assumptions without gathering facts. The building around me was quiet, except for the normal sounds of daily life from my tenants, people who paid me rent that covered my mortgage while allowing me to live exactly as I chose, without anyone's permission or approval. Over the following weeks, I had several conversations with my parents about boundaries, assumptions, and the difference between offering advice and imposing solutions. They were embarrassed by their use of fraudulent documents and police threats, though they continued struggling to understand why someone with significant resources would choose to live simply. Eventually, we reached an understanding that allowed us to maintain a relationship while respecting my autonomy. But it took months for them to stop suggesting ways I could better utilize my property or maximize my wealth-building potential. The condo they'd selected for me sold to another buyer within a week, probably to someone whose parents had successfully convinced them that home ownership was the key to adult respectability and financial security. My building continued appreciating in value while generating steady rental income, providing exactly the kind of financial security my parents had been worried about, just achieved through methods they'd never considered or understood. Here's what I learned from that Tuesday morning that started with coffee and ended with police officers in my living room. Sometimes the best investment strategy is building wealth quietly while living simply, regardless of what other people assume about your situation or their opinions about how you should display success. Conventional wisdom isn't always wise, and the people who love you most can sometimes be the ones who understand you least, especially when they're working from assumptions they never bothered to verify. The fraudulent eviction notice now hangs framed in my office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that good intentions combined with wrong assumptions can lead to remarkably bad decisions, and that sometimes the most important thing family members can do isn't offering solutions, it's asking questions first. Thanks for watching. If this story resonated with you, drop a comment about a time someone made assumptions about your life that couldn't have been more wrong. And subscribe if you want more stories about financial independence, family dynamics, and the gap between perception and reality.